Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hmm. For those of you who don't know, if it's your first time here, the Hmm is a platform for internet cultures. We put on events like the one you're at right now, and we publish research and dossiers around topics related to internet and culture. My name is Margarita Osipian, and I put the Hmm on together with Lillian Stolk, who's moderating the chat tonight, Marco Vessels, who's running the live stream, and Laurent Shares, who's documenting the program tonight via Instagram. Hey, everyone. You can get a little peek at everyone before they disappear again. For those of you who've been to our live stream before, you might notice that there's a few tweaks that we made to our live stream website, which we did in collaboration with hackers and designers. During our events, our chat is usually quite busy. People are talking, sharing links. I think it was during one of our previous events, someone had asked for a feature, which is to kind of collect all of the links that were shared in the chat and be able to save them and export them. So that's actually a feature that we implemented. So you can try it out yourself, and then you can always reference back to all the links, articles, research, and websites that we shared. So as many of you know, tonight is one of our focus events where we take a deep dive into a specific topic related to internet culture. And this time we're focusing on a topic that's extremely important, algorithmic colonialism. So last year, Zoom was criticized for canceling the webinar of Palestinian activist Leila Khaled. And in the last weeks, we've seen the power of big tech, with Palestinians being silenced on social media, Facebook invitations for protests supporting the Palestinian liberation struggle not being delivered to people, shadow banning of activist accounts on Instagram, and another good example is the disabling of the Save Sheikh Jarrah Facebook group, where over 60,000 people got info and updates. And now that group just got shut down by Facebook. So this is just really the tip of the iceberg, and it reinforces that those who control these platforms also control the narratives. And often we have no channels for recourse to question the shutting down of groups and private accounts and the banning of content. We even experienced this ourselves when our home Facebook account and our private accounts that were linked to it got disabled because one of our speakers was going to talk about QAnon. So just these small things can really cause you to lose access to groups and communities that you've been building. So 80% of Facebook users are actually not American, yet Facebook exerts its content moderation policies and ethical framework on a huge percentage of the global population. There's a domination of US tech companies making ethical decisions from a very US-centric perspective that impact people around the world. For the research of this event, we read an article written by Michael Kvet, who made a really interesting point, that by controlling the digital ecosystem, big tech corporations control computer-mediated experiences, giving them direct power over political, economic, and cultural domains of life. This is one of the many forms and manifestations of algorithmic colonialism. Technological innovations are often asserted and positioned as being universally positive and existing beyond geopolitical borders. But it's important that we understand who has the power in relation to these technologies, who creates the rules, the regulations, and whose interests are promoted. The extraction of data, one of the raw materials of digital colonialism, is parallel and interwoven with the extraction of resources like labor, cobalt, and copper from more traditional colonial systems. One of the central articles that informed our research was Abebe Berhane's article, Algorithmic Colonization of Africa. In this article, she talks about how traditional colonial power seeks unilateral power and domination over colonized people. It declares control of the social, economic, and political sphere by reordering and reinventing social order in a manner that benefits it. In the age of algorithms, this control and domination occurs not through brute physical force, but rather through invisible and nuanced mechanisms, such as control of digital ecosystems and infrastructures. Projects like Facebook's Free Basics and Alphabet's Project Loon took different approaches in their attempts to bring the internet to currently unnetworked and under-networked parts of the world. Rather than internet infrastructures being developed locally or on a national scale, large corporations have the resources to further exploit individuals by providing free or inexpensive internet. One of our speakers for tonight, Renata Avila, pointed out in her article about digital colonialism that the world's offline populations are the disputed territory of tech empires, because whoever gets them locked into their digital feudalism holds the key to the future. She makes it clear that tech giants are, without doubt, heavily influencing the way campaigns, governments, and politics operate. With very few alternatives for internet connection in many countries, it can be difficult to resist the ever-growing tentacles of big tech. But in 2016, India's telecom regulator blocked free basics, saying that it violated net neutrality rules. Instead, a national internet infrastructure began to slowly grow in India. The integration of tools developed by US tech companies in other countries often do more harm than good, especially in fields like healthcare or agriculture, where context is key. On top of that, these technologies often stand in the way and hinder the development of a local, context-specific digital economy. Why are US technology companies so eager to connect unconnected countries? To what extent do they actually help communities? And what strategies can we use to resist against algorithmic colonialism's extractive tendencies? These are just some of the questions we'll be looking into tonight, and also the questions that we explored in our research dossier on algorithmic colonialism, which you can find on our website and which we published last week. In that dossier, we have a few articles and some lists. Lillian wrote an article where she did a survey asking a number of people from different places around the world, from Russia to Zimbabwe to China, to give us insights into how the internet looks from their perspectives. I interviewed Nima Iyer, who's the founder of a technology consulting and development firm called Policy, which works on gender, equitable internet access, and how to improve data governance across African countries. And for our image contribution, we had multimedia artist EBA Camp, who's also here as a speaker tonight, and she took us into the glitches and data voids of her imperfect digital world. And we also gathered a list of initiatives in African countries that are pushing back against the data and digital infrastructure exploitation of big tech, and shared a series of must-listen podcasts on digital colonialism that really inspired our thinking and really gave us, a lot of content to kind of ponder over as we did this research. So we definitely encourage you to take a read. Lillian will be sharing the link to the dossier in the chat. So just a little bit before we get started, how things will go. So we have three really amazing speakers with us tonight. Really looking forward to it. After each speaker does their presentation, we're going to have a short 5-minute Q&A, and then we'll have a short 5-minute transition to the next speaker. So in this transition time, this is kind of where you can have a stretch, get a drink, take a little break. You can also hang out with us and continue watching the live stream. We're going to have like different questions coming through over the live stream during these little transition breaks. And then once all the presentations are done, then we're gonna have a 15-minute discussion with everyone. So as I mentioned in my intro, Lillian is gonna moderate the chat. So if you have any questions for the speakers, even if they come up while the person is speaking, just post them in the chat and Lillian will send them over to me. Also feel free to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves, share links and information, have debates inside of it. You can use it for whatever you want. I already referenced our first speaker, who is Renata Avila. Renata is an international human rights lawyer and author who's currently an HAI Race and Tech Fellow at Stanford University. As an expert in digital rights, she studies the politics of data, the evolution of transparency, and their implications on trade, democracy, and society, focusing explicitly on the phenomenon of digital colonialism. Renata is going to join us tonight to talk about her research and whether we're witnessing a new form of digital colonialism emerging. Her paper, which is titled Digital Sovereignty or Digital Colonialism, is definitely a must-read. I highly recommend it. And Lillian will also share a link to that paper in the chat, so you can also read it later on. Welcome, Renata.
Thank you for having me and welcome to my home. It is, I think that is one of the unique things of these times, these hard times, well, that we are almost getting out, that you have a chance to share a more intimate moment with all of us. And this time, today, you know, for the first time, maybe in a long time, in this kind of conversations about digital, I'm not going to blame you. I'm not going to blame you being that, you know, glued to your devices and glued to your computer all the time. For the first time, probably, I will not ask you to cover your camera. I will not ask you to install Tor and to install Signal. This conversation is going to be different because we are going to discuss power. And I think that it has been like over the last over the last basically 10 years of activism, it has been like, this obsessive focus on the individual and our behaviors, and we have been blamed on our habits. And we have been blamed on our dynamics, social dynamics, and even the so-called deterioration of democracy in infrastructure that was designed for us to do precisely that. And I don't want us to take that as the departing point, because it is unfair. It is unfair, and it has been unfair. And I think that it has been, even when we had some victories in some jurisdictions on legislation, it has been an unfair focus, a very, very fragile direction of our activism. And because we really have been the victims of the negligence, the reluctance to act of our leaders, basically. And this is, the cemetery of possibilities of 2 generations that we lost. We lost 2 generations. We lost precious time where we had the opportunity to create the technology and to open up the possibilities of access to knowledge, of access to culture, a very vibrant digital culture that were taken away from us, instead of being all glued to just new monopolies. And we have also been the victims of broken promises that were sold like an idealistic new world promoted by this kind of people. But this kind of people didn't act alone, This kind of people were joined by this kind of people. And that's the important thing that I want to make clear tonight. These new colonizers were enabled by the rules of these elected representatives that didn't stop them. And we cannot divorce the 2 things, We cannot divorce how the undermining discourse years over years that the state is bad, the state should leave our precious internet alone, the state shouldn't the state cannot innovate and shouldn't invest in technology, Silicon Valley can do it better. That very damaging narrative that started not recently, started in the 90s basically, paved the way to the problems that we have today. And we want to artificially reverse time and fix everything with regulation when it's no longer possible. So I want to point at that, because I think that the basis of digital colonialism is, which is now widespread, and the West, and you're the Netherlands and Germany, and there is no country that is free from it, basically. It was this marriage, and also this no to possibilities, this no to innovation, this defunding and deprioritizing of the what we could have, and that was taken away from us. And why the last 10 years, we have been pointing at these people and saying, you are stop using this, stop using that, stop behaviors that actually are designed for you to get hooked into, adopt and get obsessed with. And I think that, we need to go back to the bigger picture of the things and the terrible situation that we are on. And the interesting thing is how quickly and quietly Silicon Valley basically penetrated all our social infrastructure beyond social media, of course. I am not a mother, but I'm surrounded by young mothers actually and fathers, and I was impressed to see that even in the heart of Europe, in 18 months of pandemic, there has been a rapid digitization and privatization, and giving away the future of your children to Silicon Valley, for example, and how little, how decision makers are constantly sacrificing convenience and trading the future away. And of course, it would be like very easy to make a very moving narrative of the poor children in the global south. But the thing is that we are all in deep trouble. And that's the reflection that I want you to think about and consider today, that this is not only a global south problem. Of course, we cannot ignore racial issues, social inequalities, problems that will be augmented. But this problem is touching every jurisdiction, and that's important to remember. And all these leaders are not only the leaders, of developed countries that are like the mean perpetrators. Now, actually, in the circles I work and in the spaces I move in diplomacy, there's this very damaging narrative on tech for development and e-commerce for development and all for development, AI for development, you name it. And there's, in the past, poor countries stand together in a very, very resistant movement, blocking at the multilateral level when actually still the vote of a nation counts, and the vote of the majority of nations can block really bad policy from passing. Before there was this unity, and now, narratives, the same Silicon Valley narrative is dividing countries into two. It's dividing the very few countries that are aware of the terrible situation that is happening, and the rest of the country, rich and poor, going on the same boat, lured by these digital mirrors and full of empty promises. So to go quickly, because I have very little time left, I want to highlight how, of course, it's a serious problem in the global south. And it's a consequence of the unresolved problems that nobody seems to notice in the global north. Everybody thinks that regulation will be the magic pill that will limit this situation from happening. But the truth is that Brussels is full of lobbyists from these companies, that the campaigns, all the political campaigns run in Europe in those platforms, that the public education system is running on Silicon Valley platforms as well, that the healthcare, you have Palantir flying and offering their services to European nations because nobody could offer them in the same terms, at the same capacity, because nobody has as much data as they have. And I'm going super quickly on this because I wanted to share a couple of stories before I run out of time, because it is political and rooted in local corruption and elitism. This digital colonialism phenomenon, you have to deal with it in Europe, and even in Europe, you see the revolving doors of this very opaque corporate structure where people from governments come immediately after, once they finish their term, to serve in the positions of these companies. And so these revolving doors and these elites being hired and captured by Silicon Valley is a very serious problem that we haven't solved. Because if we think that we are going to tame the tech giants with regulation, we need to look very, very, very deeply into the regulatory process and who's involved. If we think that having dedicated people caring about diversity, caring about gender and racial issues, caring about compliance is going to solve our problems, I think that we are mistaken, because we have concentrated so much power and so few actors that soon, if not now, they are going to write the legislation that we think that is going to protect us. And I have these very quick two stories. Maybe I will only have the time to share one, but I was advising a presidential candidate from a South nation. And very nice, pro access to knowledge, very progressive, very nice person, complying with all the rules, fully bilingual. That doesn't happen in all the countries in the global south. So he could read perfectly well all the terms and conditions. And for a glitch in the system, his account couldn't, advertise in his political campaign. You have no idea how, if it's difficult in Europe, how a nightmare is to deal with these new envoys, these colonizers that these companies hire in the global south. Is the algorithm's use of the computer saying no, augmented in a political arena. Then I start digging and digging deeper and deeper and deeper, of course, because I'm very well connected in this world, which is not the same situation of all the political parties of all the global south. And I discovered that Nick Clegg, the former, former very prominent politician in the US, was the person in charge. And I wrote to him a very angry email saying, I'm going to sue you. After my legal threats, of course, from a Guatemalan human rights lawyer, were heard by somebody, I got a response months after. You have a candidate, all the competitors are advertising the platform, and a candidate impeded because the computer said no. And then we dig deeper, and it turns out that the person in charge of this specific issue was coming from a former government that it was with opposed views to this person. We are having very serious, clashes of private companies dealing with public issues with no accountability, no transparency, and no possibility of, even equal gains in elections. But that's not only in elections, it's in public health, it's in so many things that matter a lot for the future. I will not have time to tell the other story, but you can only imagine it's even worse because it's about a journalist. And it involves Noam Chomsky. So I will leave you with this curiosity. But what I want to tell you is we have in front of us a unique opportunity to change this. And the opportunity to change this is there will be a lot of money for technology investment in Europe very, very soon. And I'm urging you to campaign to divest from Silicon Valley, to completely divest and divorce your European public infrastructure away from Silicon Valley. I think that divesting the money and reinvesting that money in communities, in software cooperatives, in universities and in local services, re-decentralizing the potential that Europe has is the way forwards. I think that it is a very big push that we need to go to get back to the place where Europe should be. You have the education, you have the minds, you have the space, you have the resources, but you have this graveyard of that innovation and these beautiful minds and beautiful companies being eaten alive by monopolies that ask you not to compete. I think that we have very soon the possibility to reverse the things and to build the exciting future that we want and we deserve. And I not only think, I am firmly convinced that this is the way to start. Let's scrutinize them. Let's divest from them. Let's stop using their platforms for communication between public institutions and citizens. And let's start new, start fresh, start bringing the best diverse minds of our generation and the new generations into it, and let's kick them out. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Renata. That was great. You got me really pumped up. I'm also ready to kick them out of. I think you did. Your presentation is. It really articulates. Also, I think we sometimes forget. We focus on, at least I know for myself as well. I focus a lot on the private companies and what they're doing, and I think you articulated these entanglements between the private companies and the government, and also this kind of how people from who are in the government then move to be consultants in big tech firms, or they work for them, and then you really see this kind of also revolving door and how these things are much more entangled than they're made out to be, especially when we see these hearings that happen in the US, for example. I think your presentation really articulated that really well. There was already 2 questions coming in from the chat, even though me and Lillian also had like a whole list of questions for you. But I'm gonna gear it towards the audience. So the first question is from Richard. And it was asking, is digital colonialism different from data extractivism? Since this term is generally echoed a lot in the media when talking about this subject.
Yes, it is different. Data extractivism is it's a manifestation of digital colonialism. I will say that it is from the whole digital colonialism that involves, like the capture of politics, the complete dependence on infrastructures, the dynamics behind closed doors, and not only the tech, but the people enabling it. And data extractivism is a very practical way and very central way on the system of domination. I mean, without data extractivism, probably digital colonialism will be less, maybe not less effective, but less accelerated as it is now. Because it's definitely the fuel making it happen, but it's not the only element that enables it.
Great, that's a very very clear answer. So it's one of the elements that enables digital colonialism to also function as successfully as it has been functioning. So there's another question from Litsi Laszlo, who says, I'm head of strategy at Nextcloud and organize a monthly call for European companies trying to provide better equivalence. We try and coordinate on lobbying. What is your advice for getting to tables where meaningful decisions are made? It's a major hurdle.
I think that you need to get us, Mitzi. I mean, Nextcloud is one of the good. We need to in art spaces, in community spaces. You have to get the people on board and start doing the things differently. And I think that that's the way. Like we have been also brainwashed that corporations are bad, all corporations are bad for years, and actually they play a role, in our communities, but they have been disconnected and demonized from our communities. And one of the things that probably we are going to discuss a lot on, for example, the problems on racial issues and biases and technology that is not responsive for women, and technology is not designed for the dynamics of our diverse communities, is the absence of that space of interaction between the companies and the citizens. And I think that many times we think that the lobby that we need to do as a company is in Brussels with the lawmakers, but sometimes community lobby is as effective. And when the community that is closer to you loves you, and you incorporate them and decolonize somehow and open up to different views and voices, your design room. I think that is when the perception starts to change, and when the technology and the cycle of design, deployment, testing, everything of that technology changes. I think that showing, not just telling, but showing how technology can be different, how European technology can be so respectful of community, of diversity, of racial and gender issues, of inequality issues, by bringing the communities that are left out by these big companies. I think that that's a magic lobby that you can test, for example. I don't want to guarantee this is going to work, but I think that it's a nice, rather than spending on a lobbyist a lot of money that's probably being double paid by your competitor at the same time, I would say that that's the best lobby that you can do.
It's really great. Something I really loved when I was reading your article is also your comments about really centering yes, centering the people who are the most impacted by these technologies, especially the people who are often hurt the most by these technologies, and also really starting from the individual person, from the community, rather than this top-down approach. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. And of course, we'll bring all these things back in during our panel discussion at the end. Okay, let's see. So there's a question from Niels. What do you think is the role of unions in the battle to overcome issues of data colonialism? Ooh, interesting.
Oh, it's a very easy question. Very easy question. It's central, of course, but it really depends on how the union movement, how solid the union movement is in your country. If I think of countries like Finland, they can really make and shake things, like make things happen. If I think countries like mine, like in Guatemala, unionists were killed and like annihilated, and it's the same case in Colombia and other countries, so I will say that unions play a super important role, especially, service unions. They can really make pressure, but also new emerging forms of organized labor. I think that that's fundamental and beyond unions in those countries that, you cannot unionize. I believe that we need to do a lot of popular education for workers and union workers and workers inside those big companies, but also outside on the sectors affected by them. And on that impact, and also give hope on the power that the organized labor has to change the world, to transform the world. So absolutely. And I think that teachers' unions can also be very powerful in this, especially with this, many teachers they have had conversations with, horrified by what education is becoming. And that's the future, we have a duty to protect the little ones.
Thank you so much, Renata. Okay, thank you. The time is running short. I think we could talk about this forever, but we'll see you back again in our panel discussion that will happen at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I have to turn on the lights.
All right, so we're gonna take a little transition break. So it'll be 5 minutes. Like I said, you can hang out, stretch, have a drink, go to the bathroom, or hang out with us and answer these very tough quiz questions that we've prepared for you. So see you back here in 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry for that slight delay. We were just troubleshooting a few technical issues, and we had to swap our two speakers while we troubleshoot a little bit. So thanks so much for your patience. I got some info from Lillian about the quiz questions and how you all did on them. So I'm going to give the answers now. So we had the question about what is the technology ecosystem in Kenya called? And a lot of you actually thought it was called Nairobicon Valley, which sounds really great. But it's actually called Silicon Savannah. So that was the answer. The country that had the highest amount of internet shutdowns was India. Facebook's underwater internet cable around the African continent was, most of you thought it was actually called Connect Africa, which is not a bad answer, but it's actually called To Africa. And the country that successfully shut down Facebook's Free Basics initiative was India. And I think that none of you thought that Free Basics was a good idea, probably because of all the things we said about it earlier. So thank you so much, all of you, for your input and for playing along with our quiz. Let me just scroll down. So for our second speaker of the evening, I'm really happy to welcome Elisa Giardina Papa here, who's an Italian artist and whose work investigates gender, sexuality, care, and labor in relation to neoliberal capitalism and the borders of the global South. We're really happy to have Elisa with us tonight to talk about her work, Cleaning Emotional Data, which focuses on the new forms of precarious labor emerging within artificial intelligence economies. The work came out of her experience working for several human-in-the-loop companies and looks at the global infrastructure of micro-workers who clean data to train emotion recognition algorithms, providing another entry point into questions around digital colonialism for us. We asked Elisa to share an image or a reference, something that inspired her work. She shared a book called Surrogate Humanity. I don't know, Marco. Yeah, there it is. So welcome, Elisa. Maybe you can say a little bit about why you chose to share this specific book before you get started on your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me and can you see me? All is good? Yeah? Yeah, sure. I'll talk about the book while I'm presenting. Cleaning Emotional Data. First, I'm thanking you for organizing this and also inviting me to talk about my work. And I want to thank Renata. I really enjoyed her presentation. Looking forward to talk more with her at the end of the panel. And I will quickly talk about actually two projects, not just cleaning emotional data, but also a project that I did before that, because they're part of a trilogy of video installations of works that are dedicated to the topic of surrogate labor, care, and artificial intelligence. And both technologies of care and cleaning emotional data are focusing on the invisible human infrastructure of precarious workers that are sustaining the development and functioning of artificial intelligence. So I'll quickly talk also about technologies of care. That is a video installation that explores the ways in which affective and care labor are being outsourced via internet platforms. And the piece is based on conversation that I had with precarious workers who provide care labor online. This is an image of the installation. And when I say care labor, I mean broadly the labor of taking care of somebody else. So a labor that produces and modifies emotional experience in people. Therefore, a labor that produces and first and foremost social relationships. And under the category of care labor, I want to clarify that I don't make any strict distinction between sex work, reproductive labor, aids provided to the body, or the protection of the other, the creation of human relations, as I was saying. And what I try to do with the project is to trace how pre-existing inequalities in care labor, such as feminization of caregiving, paired with this lack of recognition as a wage work, and likewise the historical division of care labor between global north and global south. The global south is often providing care labor from the global north. So how these inequalities have been both intensified and obscured by digital economies. So just to give you a quick example, some examples of the workers had conversation with, and that are basically whose story are like basically creating the project. There was a biology professor from Venezuela who during the night goes to write homework for US high school students, or for example, a social media fan from Greece that for $5 delivers likes and comments on social media profiles, or ASM artist and fetish video producer from Sicily, actually Italy, that is where I'm from. And let me skip to the chatbot. So at one point, I also decided to have a conversation with algorithms, chatbots who perform emotional labor by simulating emotional intelligence. And among the chatbots I had conversation with, I want to focus on just a moment on the Invisible Boyfriend. The Invisible Boyfriend app is quite interesting for the research that I did, because it initially started as a chatbot service, but once it became clear that the clients were not falling for this algorithmically enchanted lover, the founders decided to switch to using invisible human workers instead. That is, the company determined that the computer architecture of deep neural networks necessary to perform convincing emotional labor was actually economically disadvantageous when compared to the cost of offloading the job to precarious workers. Therefore, while exchanging text with the Invisible Boyfriend, now the client is connecting globally with approximately 600 writers, gig workers, who interchangeably partner with this account to enable the fantasy of this tireless companion and tireless love-giver, the Invisible Boyfriend. So in other words, the Invisible Boyfriend is now a human-powered chatbot that employs anonymous freelancers, writers, as a surrogate for a conversational algorithm. And it is also important to note that the majority of the Invisible Boyfriend workers are women, whether or not the client built the profile of the virtual boyfriend to be a male, and as part of the contract, they're not allowed to talk about their work as a financially remunerated labor. It is therefore gender paparazzi and effaced care work, which demands that the worker participate in effacing herself as a worker. And of course, the Invisible Boyfriend workers are described by those who contract them as temporary placeholders, right, for a future of phylatomation. So a future in which forms of labor that have been historically considered unskilled or non-creative and relegated to those purposely excluded from education and wealth redistribution, these forms of work, among them also care labor, will eventually be replaced by algorithmically powered machines, right? But one could ask, is this true? Because on one hand, you have the prophets of artificial intelligence and automation who are telling us that machine will act as surrogate proxies for the dull, dirty, repetitive labor performed in the past by dispossessed workers. But on the other hand, it seems to me that AI and automation also needs continuing reproducing those paparazzi forms of labor to fulfill its initial promise. Right? So there is a process of double surrogacy or mirrored surrogacy in which machines are increasingly posing as surrogate for paparazzi work, while paparazzi workers are increasingly posing as surrogates for machine. And this is also one of the arguments, one of the topics that is analyzed by Kalin Dvora and Neda Tonisowski in the book that we were discussing at the beginning with Margarita, that is Surrogate Humanity. And this book has been key also for my research. Okay, so this process of double surrogacy that I was describing before, that is impoverished workers posing a surrogate of and for the machine, I think is likewise traceable in the work of the massive human infrastructure that is currently sustaining the development and the functioning of artificial intelligence. It can be traced, for example, in the extensive decentralized workforce of the data cleaners, that are workers contracted by so-called human-in-the-loop companies to process data that are later used to train machine vision systems. The data cleaners basically label, categorize, annotate, and validate massive amounts of data, thereby enabling artificial intelligence to function. And here is where I quickly reconnect and then close with the last project that I wanted to talk about, that is cleaning emotional data. That is a project that closed this trilogy of work and that I finished in 2020, so 1 year ago. So for this project, I myself temporarily worked as a human in the loop, and I documented I was back in Palermo at the time. I took a pause from my PhD at Berkeley. I was doing research on artificial intelligence, and somehow I ended up working as a human in the loop to understand better the connection between labor, invisible labor, and artificial intelligence. And I particularly focus in this research in the labor involved in training machine vision systems to see. And within like the operations that are used to teach machine vision system to see, I particularly focused on the two operations of bounding and naming. That is, for example, one of the tasks that I performed over and over again was to draw bounding boxing to outline the contours of, in videos and images, like hundreds of images and hundreds of video, to outline the contours of objects and subjects, distinguishing humans from things from humans, humans from animals, animals from things, etc. So tracing borders to distinguish what belong to what, and then name the predefined taxonomic belonging. So maybe we could say that to teach a machine to see is so much about rescribing the modern and colonial desire of classification, of borders, of categories, of taxonomies, and ultimately hierarchies. So to somehow reimpose the order of things. And this orderly impulse also became clear to me in several other tasks that I did as a human in the loop, and for example, were more connected to the area of affective computing. For example, one of the tasks that I did that I'm showing in the video was to recognize and rate emotions in faces. Or, for example, another task that I did was to produce videos of my facial emotional expression for data sets that were later used to train AI to recognize emotions. And this was actually a turning point in the research that I was doing, because right at the beginning, when I started to produce the short videos, some of my facial expressions were actually rejected. It seems that my expression of certain emotion were not matching the crude categories in which they were supposed to fit in. My face was not, I don't know, happy enough and not happy in the right way. I'm not actually sure. And what I'm not actually sure about is where the rejection came from. For example, an algorithm, or for example, another worker who maybe due to cultural differences understood my facial expression in a different way. So after the rejection of those videos, I became more and more interested in the logic, theories, and methods underpinning the taxonomization of emotion within machine vision. And so really the question for me became, how do machines recognize emotions? And we're basically back to the 19th century with Duchenne de Boulogne, Darwin, and physiognomy. That is, we're back to the myth of universality, transparency, and truth, according to which emotions are universal and they can be fully revealed, made transparent, reduced, and measured within an ideal scale that can provide the ground to make comparisons and judgments. And within this framework, emotional states are reduced to discrete facial muscles movement that can be separated, named, and reduced to their smallest unit possible, and then recombined to be classified. If I move this muscle and then this muscle and then this muscle, that is supposed to be a smile, or like a true smile. If I don't move the muscle but the other muscle, that is supposed to be a false smile. And these kind of experiments are coming from the French neurologist Duchenne de Boulogne, who made these experiments in the 19th century by triggering the facial muscular contraction of his patients. And there could be much to say about Duchenne's relationship with his patients in terms of power dynamic and power relation, right? Anyway, his stated intent was to create a universal map of emotion. And sorry for the historical excursus, but I think this is quite important because basically the same method is used today, only slightly revised, in the Paul Ekman FACS method, that is a facial action coding system method that is used today by the CIA, FBI, and TSA to detect deception in facial expressions. And is also widely implemented in face recognition and machine vision. It's also used for CGI animations. Is used for a similar method is used for the Animoji of your smartphones. So it is basically a method that is crossing the military, industrial, surveillance, spectacle, tech industry complex. So from the 19th century to Hollywood to your phone and then to the FBI. So all this research now I am going to conclude became a video essay in a 3-channel video installation in which on one hand I collected the tasks that I performed as a data cleaner during those 3 months in which I worked as a data cleaner, and on the other side, on the other hand, I'm tracing and critiquing the history of emotion recognition, starting from the 19th century and then finishing with artificial intelligence. So now to conclude, I guess what I've been trying to explore with both technologies of care and specifically with the example of the invisible boyfriend and then with cleaning emotional data and my own work as a data cleaner is that once you try to open up the so-called black box of artificial intelligence, you try to understand the political and economic ideologies within which that black box originated, inside what you find is, I believe, the old entanglement between capitalism and colonialism. In terms of labor, through this process of double surrogacy that I was describing, according to which machines are posing as impoverished workers, while pauperized workers are posing as machines, as in the case of the invisible boyfriend, to a certain extent also in the case of the invisible labor of the data cleaners that are sustaining the functioning of artificial intelligence. And also, I think that this old entanglement of capitalism and colonialism can also be seen, can be traced in the logic and ideology that is implemented in machine vision. So what I'm talking about precisely is this modern patriarchal and colonial project of bounding, bordering, naming, imposing a normative classificatory order of things that keeps excluding everything that in our lives, ways of embodiment or ways of perceiving, ways of desiring defy rigid categorization and hierarchies. So it's like really this cleaning out that excess that I believe is uncomputable, but it needs to be cleaned out in order for artificial intelligence to function. Okay. I guess I'll stop my screen sharing now.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow, there's a lot to unpack. Also, this notion of the double surrogacy, I find that like it's quite an interesting, it's an interesting concept, the way you explained it. So I'm processing that in my head because it has quite a lot of complexities to it.
Okay.
I was wondering, what I found really interesting about this project is that you chose to also like embed yourself as a worker that cleans this data. So you became a worker yourself in the process of researching and making this work. And I was just wondering why you felt that was an important part of the process instead of, for example, maybe reading articles about the workers or interviewing other people that did this kind of labor.
Yeah, I mean, like it just happened. Like sometimes I like to work in a more like documentary like way, and I like to get in contact with people who are like working, like in the case of technologies of care. In that case, I just ended up like wanting to know more about artificial intelligence, but again, from the point of view of labor, from the point of view of this kind of like invisible infrastructure that is sustaining the systems of artificial intelligence. And I just thought that the best way to try to understand more was to just do the labor, basically. It wasn't like really not a conscious choice. I just started to try to understand more, and then I just understood that the best way to do it was to do the labor.
Just seeing if there's any questions in the chat. No questions yet, but lots of people think the work is really amazing and interesting. So yeah, you talked about So in addition to the video works in this project, there's also a series of textiles, and you say on your website that they juxtapose the abstract lines of facial microexpressions detected by the algorithms with untranslatable emotional vernacular from both Sicilian dialect and American English. Maybe you could talk a bit about this untranslatable emotional vernacular, like to me, it's like what I sort of, when you were talking about your presentation and what you uncovered, it's also, to me, this untranslatable part is this moment where you sort of open up these other potentials for this kind of technology, or you sort of break apart this sort of intention to compartmentalize everything. And I was just wondering about that, like what that means to you. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about it.
I think that was due to the fact first that I was back in Sicily. I was living in Palermo at the time, and there was this interesting disconnection for me between doing this kind of like labor, and particularly in this kind of like reordering of things, like bounding boxing and naming. And then so after hours of like tracing contours of things, I would go just take a break, go around the city of Palermo and just look around myself. I would just and the whole like ordering of things in a city like Palermo, in general, like I guess in like southern like cities in Sicily, just like stop to make sense. Like that is a city, like if you try to grasp it, it might end up grasping you instead. So you like really understand physically how the way of like categorizing, taxonomizing, and like making order, it just doesn't function like with a city like Palermo, but also doesn't function in life. And to me, it's the same thing about emotions. And maybe like because I had like the dialect fresh in my mind when I was back there, but and I guess everybody speak a dialect, to speak a language that is not so easily translatable with like Google Translate, how certain things are just not translatable. So while I was doing the labor of like labeling emotions, and the categories that I had as emotion were like 6. Like, what do you mean 6? Why are we supposed to have just like 6 categories of emotion? I can start to make a list of like all the different emotions that are not included there. And I can also make a list of like way of saying, like in the Sicilian language, that are not translatable at all in those 6 emotions. And that's why I started to think about also producing these textiles in which I created these embroideries in a language that is not so easily translatable. And I like the idea of working with, particularly in relation to the systems, right? To work with like opacity and queerness and like the untranslatable, everything that is just not able to be like, that we cannot put in this like neat and rigid and like normative categories that are like really the kind of logic that is implemented in these systems.
Yeah. There's a question from the chat from Mayako asking, what are ways of disrupting these classifications? Are there any hacks or art initiatives that try to subvert these norms that you know about?
I don't know if I can name like a precise like initiative, but for sure, like at least also my influence is a lot like queer theory, and also and that I think like is a good starting point. But I'm also thinking about Glissane, and that is a Martinican like poet, a philosopher who's been like who wrote a lot about opacity, because like really the point is like. We were talking about like diversity in relation to algorithms. Do we want to create like more categories? Do I want my emotional vernacular from Sicily to be understood by the algorithm? Maybe not. Right? It's not that I want more categories. I want to preserve a space for this kind of opacity, a space for things that are not so easily translatable. Instead of incorporating more and more categories into this, logic, because I just think that is wrong logic. This is not how we're supposed to look. It's the logic of creating like sameness and diversity, creating hierarchies. That to me is a colonial logic.
Yeah, I love Glissante's idea of this opacity. I think maybe I'll see if I can share a link to the text. But it's really beautiful to think about our right to opacity and not to always be constantly visible as well. This kind of hyper visibility that also comes through, of course, the surveillance systems that we're in, but also this kind of constant classification and putting people into, putting our emotions, our movements, everything that we see around us into these specific kind of categories and systems.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're running a little bit late on time, but we'll continue the conversation in the panel discussion. So I'll see you back there, back here a little bit later. And thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're gonna do another little maybe 3-minute transition, let's say, since we're running a little bit late on time. So again, you can take a little break and we'll see you back here in, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes. And hopefully we'll have everything on track on our end here. So see you back here. There will be a few new questions for you during the break. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So thanks for answering all of our questions during the break. We asked if people want us to continue organizing online events even after this pandemic is over, if it will ever end. And a lot of you do want us to continue organizing online events, which is great to hear. We also asked where people are watching from. We have people who are watching from the Bijlmer, from Eindhoven, from The Hague, from Nijmegen, but also from Zagreb and from Berlin. So thanks everyone for joining in from lots of different places. So our final speaker for tonight is Ibiye Camp, who's a multidisciplinary artist whose work engages with technology, trade, and material within the African diaspora. She's joining us to talk about her artistic practice and her work, Data, the New Black Gold, which explores how citizens could take ownership of the data generated from their cities to prevent exploitation. The work looks at how data has materialized in the West African landscape and what the spatial consequences of its production, consumption, and storage are. We also asked EBA to share an image that inspired her work. And she shared this image with us that Marco will pull up, which is the Emergency Sports Center. So welcome, Ibiye, and maybe you can start by telling us about this Emergency Sports Center.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. So the Emergency Sports Center, this is a photograph I took on kind of a main road in Freetown in Sierra Leone. And basically there's a lot of kind of public spaces which are kind of called, the structures are called pan bodies because they're made out of kind of metal kind of sheets. And I found it super fascinating because a lot of entrepreneurial kind of businesses have been like started up in these spaces. And I just love the fact that it said an emergency sports center because like, you know, everyone's kind of very into kind of football and all sorts of like esports in Freetown. So I thought that this pan body really showed the urgency for entrepreneurial spirit, but also to enjoy gaming and sports. So this was my kind of image that I was quite inspired by, but also I guess the idea that along the front of the Emergency Sports Centre, there are just kind of like Arsenal and Chelsea, which are all kind of football teams in the Premier League in London, I mean, in London and England. And I thought that that was very interesting that on the Emergency Sports Centre, it's kind of very much a UK kind of image. And that kind of got me started to think about kind of digital imperialism and how we kind of are still kind of connected to the colonial powers, which kind of, you know, colonized in West Africa, even through like digital infrastructures today. So yes, that's the kind of beginning of some of my research into kind of digital imperialism.
Great, thank you. It's a very interesting image to share. If we can pull up your slides.
Thank you. Sorry for all the technical glitches. I think that's kind of meets kind of what we're talking about today quite well, especially with some of my work. So I am speaking to you from London, and I am British Nigerian, and my work kind of reflects, I guess, exploration of my my heritage and the way that kind of technology kind of manifests in the West African landscape and in the UK, and that kind of maybe inequality or kind of awkwardness of kind of technical infrastructures being kind of put into the landscape in West Africa, and the kind of corporations that kind of run these big tech companies. So like I said before, I was inspired by looking into digital kind of imperialism because of the pan-body enterprises. And basically, what is really fascinating about the pan-body enterprises is that it kind of like creates like a community around the pan-body where people will be playing PlayStation games, watching the Premier League, kind of updating mobile phone and what's really interesting about mobile phones in West Africa is that they have like these package deals, which is like the free basic. So I think it was mentioned before in the past and the previous presentations that Facebook has like a free basic where you can kind of have a number of data and kind of upload and send videos, but it's always kind of like a particular video which kind of circulates around a community. And so this is kind of the key point of my dissertation, is looking into the entrepreneurial spirit, but also the question of the corporations and the package deals which are set in kind of Freetown and Lagos for customers to use. So this is also kind of reflected in how people reinterpret kind of digital infrastructures as well. And I was quite inspired by Nollywood as well, how Nollywood is kind of a new take on Hollywood as well. So I think the slide that you're looking at the moment is kind of a Google map view of Lagos. And there was a market called Balogun Market, which I looked at the beginning of my research. And I was really interested in how Balogun Market is represented on Google. And if I had a video originally, but when you kind of drop the figure into the landscape and walk around the site, that is when you kind of see the surroundings, and it's really not a representation of how Balogun Market really is. So this starts to make me question the visual representation of Lagos, of Nigeria online. So I studied at the RCA. This is actually where I teach as well, in Demonic Shores with Dele Adeyemo and Damasa Randolph. And when I was studying, we started to look at post-human institutions and data centers. And I began looking at kind of the fiber optic cables which link kind of West Africa to the rest of the world. And Lagos is a very important point in this map, because it also, from Lagos also kind of exports data and information to the rest of West Africa. And what's quite daunting about these maps is that kind of James Bridle kind of explains how the mapping of the fiber optic cables is a kind of a repeat of the colonial empire and the existing kind of trade routes that would go through West Africa. And this is kind of made into a digital kind of colonial kind of mapping system through the fiber optic cables. And this is where I started to question how energy security and overseas corporations kind of set up stock in West Africa. And what I realized is that actually data is a kind of similar sector to the oil sector in Lagos. And even the way that the fiber optic cables kind of go through the map, oil pipelines kind of map around the Niger Delta. And my family is actually from the Niger Delta. So this is kind of like a key point in starting my project, as I was kind of reflecting on what existing infrastructures and parties there were. So these are kind of images of quite famous images, which you've probably seen a lot of the oil pipelines which have leaked across the Niger Delta. And they're kind of put in a very kind of rudimentary way, which means that they are easily damaged. And this is a way of controlling the landscape. And from this, because of the inequality of the corporation setting up kind of oil fields, and because of lack of jobs and having to rebuy the oil that's been refined in overseas countries, people then kind of start to oil bunker. So it's like a cycle of violence, which basically corporations blame neighboring communities and neighboring communities blame government. And so what I found really interesting is that the oil sector has a similar type of infrastructure as well, where corporations basically create these mega cities, which kind of don't really regard the people that live in Lagos Island. So these are kind of shots showing how Lagos Island has grown due to, huge population. I think there's 21 million people that are now living in Lagos, which makes it the most kind of populated city in Africa. And this is where Lagos is also where there's multiple mega cities, but there's also Yaba, which is also called Yabacon Valley, which is obviously a play on Silicon Valley. And when I was in Lagos, I was researching the data center Main One, which is the largest data center in West Africa. And what was super interesting is that Main One data center has to have 99.99 power uptime. And I was quite confused by this, because obviously there's parts of Lagos Island that tend to have about 5 hours of electricity a week. So even in the idea of, a certain kind of sector of Lagos having complete kind of overrunning oil diesel tanks, and then the rest of the population has to rely on very kind of like toxic diesel tanks. And as I continued to research into this data center, I actually found that in 2019, there was a data leak where customers' IP addresses or IP accounts were rerouted to a corporation in China. And this corporation is actually known for corporate surveillance. And it was just written about as an ugly mistake. Whereas some of you might know the term the Nigerian prince. And this is a 419 scamming kind of group who scam people into kind of sharing their data and sharing that information. And I see the two, the data leak from Main One and the 419 are the same thing, but they get treated very differently. Again, similar to the oil bunkering with the corporations, with the overseas corporations, and with individuals bunkering in the neighboring villages. And so I think that's where my project, Data the New Black Gold, was kind of born, and was thinking about how people could start to collect data in a way to kind of start to take back control of how data is collected in the streets. And so I started to concentrate on the markets in Lagos and also in Sierra Leone. Lagos is a very kind of, it's a digital hub of Africa, whereas Sierra Leone, due to the due to Ebola, due to the kind of the war that happened for most of the early noughties, Sierra Leone has kind of isn't kind of as technologically developed as Lagos. So it was quite an interesting kind of balance between how people in the markets, how kind of kiosks and independent kind of technological communities could start to take control of their data. And so I started to scan the streets of Lagos and in Freetown, and I was kind of quite focused on points of data exchange. So you'll start to see that there are kind of these kiosks in the streets where you can kind of go to top up your data, or here is a wheelbarrow where someone was kind of ordering kind of fruits and stuff. And I started to see these points of exchange as a kind of entry point into how a corporation, or not a corporation, a cooperative is kind of run within the markets. And I'm not sure if the slide is moving, but what is quite interesting is that as I began to scan these sites, I started to see a bit of a visual imbalance in my scans. So a lot of people probably are aware of photogrammetry, which is a form of scanning which is built up from photographs and measurements. And basically the way that photogrammetry works is that when the images are kind of tied together, they create a model. And this is kind of the way that I was thinking that people could start to collect their data, is just from photographs. So what you actually find when you make the model is that the actual photogrammetry software doesn't quite understand the landscapes which I am kind of showing. This is particularly because the landscapes need to be still, or they need to be lit in a certain way. And also a lot of these scanning softwares don't understand black. And so if there is a person of color, a lot of the time they are not registered. And this is a problem which has come up a lot in kind of facial recognition and surveillance, particularly in kind of all over the world, actually. So with my project, it started off thinking about how data could be collected. And I designed these kind of area snap kind of devices, which mimic kind of the trolleys, which are called omoleke in Lagos. And, I kind of named them kind of similar names in Creole and Nigerian Pidgin. And the idea is that these area snap devices could go around and start to collect data, but it's all data that will be kind of owned by the market in the individuals. And it's one of these things where you don't really know what your data could eventually grow into. It could grow into a type of commodity and something that can eventually be traded with, and especially that these are kind of villages and spaces which are growing immensely. So the idea is that people will eventually be able to control the data that is taken from their cities. And also the spaces are kind of created into a bit of a glitch. You can see that the actual sites kind of resist being scanned as well. And this is kind of a bit of a touch upon the hyper visibility that was mentioned in the previous presentation as well, and how actually these softwares and like photogrammetry, like scanning, like LiDAR scanning, aren't actually even kind of designed to understand spaces like Balogun Market and Lapa Street in Freetown. And so I ended up making a film which kind of emphasizes the voids and the glitches of the technology, which I will present next, and it's just about 4 minutes long. But this film is really about kind of showing the kind of imbalance in understanding the landscape. It's also kind of celebrating the resistance to being read as well. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for watching just kind of the clip of my film. This was particularly a film that kind of represented kind of essence of the markets. So I kind of kept the kind of sounds of the market traders and kind of shuffling my feet as we walked through this very kind of busy space. And it was, the intention wasn't to kind of give the whole kind of experience of the space, but how it's actually a space of resistance. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna give I'm gonna do one question, and then we'll be able to continue our conversation in the panel discussion. But I know that you also have a background in architecture, and I was wondering how you see in your work how you see data as a kind of architecture or something that shapes our landscapes.
Yeah, completely. I think that the fact that that the idea of Lagos being a space where people could kind of, where so much data is kind of created, the idea is that a space that has a huge population is essentially like a data kind of mining place or hub or way of generating kind of information. So I see that kind of spatially a site like Lagos would almost be of great value just because of the population, just because of how much kind of infrastructure is kind of like going to be there and how much is predicted to be there in the future. And I think the way that I look at data as an architectural kind of point of design is to kind of speculate on those futures.
Thank you. I'm just going to share a little comment from the chat since you don't get to see the chat. But there was a nice comment from Jord who said that your work is really amazing and that they were really excited to find out that you also created the visuals for Duval Timothy's GroundNut as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that so the GroundNut video was also thinking about visibility and storytelling with the kind of story of groundnut farming in Freetown. So Duval, my partner, and me, we both kind of like started kind of scanning spaces and speaking to people. So it kind of included storytelling and visuals that don't quite give away the whole kind of practice of groundnut farming and making groundnut soup. Thank you very much for mentioning that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to invite everybody back in, so Renata and Elisa to join. Great. Okay, we're all here. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you all so much for these amazing presentations. Yeah, it gives us a lot to think about. As we wait for comments to come in from the chat, I'm going to look back at some of the questions that we had come up with. And I was thinking about we see digital colonialism as this extension and even an exacerbation of traditional colonial systems. That's something we talked about throughout the evening. And for me, it also feels like we need to think of new creative ways to get out of these kinds of systems so we don't repeat these same cycles. One thing that I loved about Ibia's project was this like speculative aspect to it. We talk about this a bit more in the interview that I did with her, which is in the dossier. It imagines this kind of world where people can scan their own environment and have ownership over the kind of data that big tech is not really able to get access to. And maybe we can just start with ABA first and then move through some Renata or Elisa who want to answer. But I was wondering what you think about the role of speculative thinking as a way to move out of these kind of sometimes like very traditional ideas and power systems that we are often like maybe we feel trapped inside of.
For me, I guess, as I mentioned, the voids in the scans is kind of what visually made me start to realize how I need to start rethinking the technologies which I've been using. And I think that the voids, moments of the landscape, like mainly the signage in the streets were very kind of visible. And I think that there were elements of but like the more ground level where the kekes and the people were moving in the streets is something that then kind of disappeared and became more of a ghostly kind of presence. And that's where I started to realize that actually the movement and the fluidity of these spaces is going to be very unattainable. So it made these voids, which then made me kind of rethink how these spaces can be understood, and maybe how it's brilliant that they can't be understood, and maybe we should just kind of continue to make things that resist technology. So everything needs to be moving, so they can't be traced and tracked in a similar way. So I guess kind of starting to analyze more visually kind of brought out questions and speculations.
Thank you. Renata, I don't know if you want to touch on that a bit. I saw like a really nice link there, more in line to what we had talked about during your Q&A, which is the importance of starting from people and communities first when it comes to digital governance and the creation of new technological infrastructures. But maybe you also want to touch on this speculative idea as well.
Well, not really, like that's very abstract for me, but I want to mention something that Ibi mentioned on infrastructures, and like it is only natural that the new colonialism is going to use the infrastructures of the past colonialism. It's practical, and many of the same logics, and to this same logic, I want to refer to one of the examples that I didn't have the chance to share with everybody on how both colonialism and neocolonialism has been relying on willing elites. And elites in highly unequal countries are not necessarily the best of our societies, as the word might suggest. It's quite the opposite. So I am very curious because, I guess that is the same what happens with the oil industry and with, big energy companies and these big monopolies of power and resources in many of the countries in Africa and Latin America. If you follow the money and follow the names, you see the same families, as in the past, controlling everything. And I think that together with naming and shaming Mark Zuckerberg, we need to name and shame our own, spoiled rich kids that are profiting out of people and depriving people from this public infrastructure. And that brings me to the other point of public infrastructure. Is public infrastructure being privatized and being removed from democratic controls? And that's the thing that I find very, very difficult to debate and to even dialogue with people in my country, because we are fed up of corrupt governments, fed up. And so you are left with questions, because you say so many people believe that companies deliver better and that private is better than public. And then it is, I still struggle to answer the whys, and the whys are more in the long term than in the short term, but it is, it's hitting the wall of arguments so many times. And of course, we need to work local, but we also need to impact national and regional politics. And I know how difficult it is, for example, in the African Union and beyond, to even discuss these topics when you have like people dying and people just without access to electricity. So it's tough work, not easy. And I didn't answer the question, but I wanted to use the time to mention this.
I think, I mean, you do touch on it a little bit in terms of that it's not, it's not just centered on one group of people, that like really looking at the interconnections, and especially not necessarily putting the blame on how individual people use the internet, which you talked about quite a lot in your introduction as well. Maybe Lisa, I was wondering if you might want to go back to the first question that I'd asked, which is maybe this kind of idea of creating these sort of, the importance of creating these sort of speculative projects as well, to sort of think ourselves out of these, to also like use our imaginations to think ourselves out of these systems.
Yeah, sorry, now I'm thinking about infrastructure.
You can also continue.
No, I love like the presentation that EBA gave, and I'm thinking about, since you're working on the like kind of like physical infrastructure and the kind of like tracing one infrastructure of colonialism, imperialism after the other, so oil and then data. Like in my case, I'm working on the human infrastructure that is even less visible, right? But still, as the trace of history. And in terms of like speculative imagination, right? And so let's stop to just be so focused on the system that we have right now, the kind of technologies that we have right now, but let's start to imagine other ways in which technologies can work. Because either we stop to use technologies, right? Or we start to imagining other kind of technologies. And so I'm also referring back a little bit at the question that was posed to me after my quick talk about hacking the technology. I guess at this point, I'm just not about hacking the technology anymore. I'm about imagining other kind of technologies. And that's why I both liked the reference that Renata was making about community. When you start from the community, like you start to imagine different ways in which people would like to use technology, and even another kind of imagination for technologies, instead of just focusing on what we have and how to hack it and how to change it. Because when you work with the community and when you work also in architecture and with the city, you just like understand, as like in my case working in Palermo, that city, like you cannot like drive a Google self-driving car in Palermo. It just doesn't work. The city works in a different way. And I guess it was the same thing that also EBA was saying about, how do I map this space that doesn't stay still with that technology? So you have to invent like a new way, even like, visual imagination to even represent the city. And also it's so beautiful, EBA, like in your presentation, this idea of representing something but like keeping the resistance, right? So I don't know if I'm answering really the question, but in terms of like speculation, I'm thinking both visually, like how do you tell stories, how do you do storytelling, how do you represent, but within resistance, right? Now by showing everything but preserving like opacity. And in terms of like technology and like data, why not? Let's collect the data of the community, but like let's collect it in a way that just like doesn't make sense with the logic that are used right now to mine data. And like think about other logic in which we can start to think about data, we can start to think about technology, we start to think if artificial intelligence is really useful and how and for who. Sorry, I'm just like connecting things that I'm excited about. I don't know if I'm like just answering your questions. It's coming more out of excitement than trying to answer.
No, I think it's really great because also, I mean, like, when we chose the three of you, like we knew about your projects, but then as the presentations were happening, then also these interconnections really emerged. So I actually liked how you're sort of bringing all of these things together. And I was also thinking about these kinds of tensions. I think me and ABA talked about that as well during our call that we had, but about also sometimes maybe it's not a bad thing that people with darker skin tones are not recognized by certain like surveillance cameras, for example. So looking at these kinds of complexities or tensions between these things. And then I also, I was thinking about like this work of scanning this market, and then but leaving all these glitches and these spaces for opacity, as you had mentioned, Elisa. So I think that's it's really interesting how these projects are kind of percolating into one another. I don't know, Ibi, if you wanted to respond, or else I'm going to bring a question in from the chat.
Let's have a question from the chat. So it'd be nice to hear.
So there's a question from Bamburo, who says that this question is probably for Renata, but let's see. So there is a campaign where people are giving low ratings to the Facebook and Instagram apps as a reaction to their censorship of news about the resistance in Palestine. Do you think this is a way of fighting back that has some potential? Didn't know about this campaign.
I didn't know about the campaign, but of course, this is small action, collection of small actions. But the problem is that they own the telephones, they own the operative systems. Basically, two big monopolies own all our telephone systems. So it is like, I think that the conflict in Palestine, like I remember the first conflict in Palestine, 2000, not the first conflict in Palestine, I mean, it has been an ongoing colonization process. And there's many, many lessons to learn from the people of Palestine. And one of the lessons is the resilience and sovereignty of their communications and how they have managed to, they cannot depend on companies because they know how volatile and so vulnerable of the decisions in the U.S. companies are. So I think that yes, it is a big message that users can send, but it's not the solution of the problem, and it's a viable protest. But I want to go back to my pledge to divest from Silicon Valley. That hurts. That really hurts. If we stop paying, I mean, not only with our data, but simply paying public money into Silicon Valley, that's significant. That's significant because it cuts the dependency. And I think that the most important thing that we need to do with the Palestine issue is to expose to our policymakers and say, hey, policymaker, hey, politician, they're biased. They're politically biased, and they are violating our rights. But the same way that they are violating the rights of expression and mobilization of Palestinian people, the same way they can do it here. So I think that we need to create that level of literacy and awareness among the political class, because they care about it. Of course, they really care about it. And the moment that they care about it and that they know they have the power to act, and the moment that they organize is when the companies in Silicon Valley start to be afraid of. And I know that it's a double-edged sword, and I know that we need to be very careful with it. But yes, it's a legitimate action. It has to be combined with a series of actions that take our trust and our public digital sphere out of the hands of basically 2-3 corporations that are so vulnerable to US politics.
Thank you. This kind of links to another question that came through in the chat, which was saying that if we look at the historical examples in overt colonial regimes, how do you think the overthrowing of the colonial power and technology will take place? What, if anything, can we learn to topple these powers or have them get out? So, Renata, you were talking about divestment. Maybe other people have some other strategies that they're kind of envisioning and imagining.
I guess that it would probably be what we've been discussing is kind of new systems rather than kind of this isn't overtly kind of following how, well, we're still living in a colonized world, really. Post-colonialism is just kind of a carry on from kind of the damage which has been done to kind of the global south. But I think that new systems, I think, will be a way to kind of change the way that digital colonialism is kind of like within our society, maybe not using platforms. And I think that's what is so interesting about these little kind of communities of the digital enterprises in Sierra Leone, is that they are kind of like employing people and running things in a really kind of independent, cooperative way. And so I see that this could potentially start to grow as kind of the population in Freetown kind of gets kind of more advanced with new kind of technological developments, that they will start to run. It's a bit like I'm optimistic that is actually already happening in a way.
Thank you. Elisa, did you want to add anything to?
Maybe, yeah, just like to create a bridge, but like when I'm thinking about divestment, yeah, I agree. Like divestment, as Renata was saying, in those like 3-4 corporation, as that is the only model possible, and thus I guess divestment in that kind of logic itself, like why AI needs to work that way, why machine vision needs to work that way. So it's divestment in the visual culture and the kind of like ideology and the kind of like way of seeing the world. So to me, it's like a double divestment. An investment in another like speculative imagination of like what the systems like can do and can be.
Yes. I don't know if Renata, you want to add one more thing to the divestment, or divestment is the.
Well, the other side of the coin, that is investment. Investment of our public money, of our public funds, or all the recovery funds, locally tagged to benefit the communities that we want to like assist. I will say that's what I would like to see, because together with the divestment, that money, those resources need to go and be double up in our communities. So I think that's also a way to, like, when we need to invest a lot, and it will take time to develop local capacities. But it will be like we also will get the flavor the same way like that many movements around the world has recovered the flavor for their own food, that's locally grown, that's locally, produced, and that is adequate for our climate. The same way we need to do it with technology. So it is, we cannot dismiss the creative part of it.
Thank you so much. We're already running quite late over our time, but thank you all so much for your amazing presentations and for this conversation. There's obviously so much to talk about. I think we had like 20 other questions written down that we haven't even gotten to, but I just want to thank all of you for being here with us, and for sharing your work and your research and your knowledge. Highly recommend for everyone to look deeply into Elisa's, Ibia's, and Renata's work and research, because there's a lot to learn there. So thank you all. And now I'm going to do a few. Thank you. So again, a big thanks to all of our wonderful speakers tonight. Thank you to the audience for being here with us, also for bearing with us through some of our little technical glitches that we had. I also want to thank the Stimulating Funds and the AFCA for supporting the work that we do. That is also a form of investment, investing into other kinds of practices. So big thank you to them. So you can also sign up for our newsletter. It's a little QR code, so you can get them in your inbox. And I mentioned before that we had gotten banned from Facebook, and the only way that we had actually gotten back on was through the support of Bits of Freedoms, which is a privacy rights organization in the Netherlands. So I just want to do a big shout out to Bits of Freedom, because if it wasn't for Reo at Bits of Freedom, we would not have even found out why we got banned, and we would not have ever been able to get our accounts back. So we recommend supporting the work that Bits of Freedom does. You saw a little slide coming through that was our Telegram link, which is we have like a Telegram channel which you can join, and then every 2 weeks we send articles that we've been reading to your inbox on a Saturday morning, so you can spend the weekend reading about some of the things that we've been reading about, all related to digital and internet culture. So please mark your calendars. We have one more event before we take a little break for the summer, which is going to be on June 23rd. And it's going to be one of our fast-paced events. So these really short 5-minute talks. And this time it's going to be focused on one of our favorite topics over the last year, which is online events. So we're going to invite people who are doing all kinds of interesting things, experimenting with new platforms, building their own platforms, like we've done with our live stream, and really engaging in this kind of online event world in a new way. So please join us at that event before we go away for the summer. And just one final note, that for those of you who still have like the energy left in you, we are going to hang out for a little bit in one of our newly built rooms. So we're using Oye as the platform where we've created like some really fun rooms to hang out in after our events. And so Lillian's going to post the link for the Tamagotchi room. So you can move over there if you are still feeling up for chatting a little bit more, maybe asking some questions, or just playing around in this space. There's a few secret links in the room that will take you to other hidden spaces. And these rooms were built and designed by Rosa Poelmans and Jeppe Liefbroer, who are students at the Design Art Technology Department at Artes in Arnhem. So big thank you to them for building some of these crazy rooms for us. There's also some meeting rooms that you can use yourselves if you want. So please check it out. That's all from me. I'm just going to say goodbye, but I'll see you all in our hangout room in a little bit. Have a good night.